I thought I knew my son. 63 years on this earth, 2 tours in the Gulf, a career spent fixing other people's broken machinery. And I still didn't see it coming. The thing that nearly killed me wasn't a roadside bomb or a faulty engine. It was a cup of coffee sitting on my own kitchen counter. Let me back up. My name is Eugene Parrish, if we're being formal, but nobody's called me that since my mother passed. I'm 63 years old, retired pipe fitter, live alone in the same house I bought with my late wife Connie back in 1991. It's a modest place outside of Knoxville. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, half an acre of yard that I keep mowed mostly out of habit. Connie loved that yard. After she died of ovarian cancer 7 years ago, I kept the roses she planted along the fence line because cutting them down felt like losing her twice. My son Mitchell is 34. He's a good-looking kid, got his mother's jaw and my stubbornness, and for the first 30 years of his life, I thought I'd done something right raising him. He was the kind of boy who carried groceries for the elderly woman next door without being asked. He coached Little League one summer just because nobody else would. When Connie got sick, he drove 4 hours every weekend to sit with her. Then he married Renee. I want to be careful here, because I spent a long time trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. Renee is 31, sharp as a tack, and the kind of woman who makes everything look easy. She had a good job in pharmaceutical sales. Ironic, I know, given what I found out later. And she kept an immaculate house and always brought something when she came to visit. Wine, a pie, fresh flowers. She knew all the right moves. What she didn't bring was warmth, not real warmth. You can feel the difference when you've lived long enough. Connie used to say you could tell a person's true character by watching how they behaved when they thought nobody important was watching. Renee watched who was important. And after about a year of marriage, it became clear that I was not on that list. The small things came first. She'd redirect Mitchell mid-sentence whenever he started talking about his childhood. She'd make plans for holidays and mention them to Mitchell first, then present them to me as though they were already settled. When I'd call the house phone, she'd answer and tell me Mitchell was busy, and he'd call back days later sounding tired and a little distant, like a man who'd been talked out of something. But I kept showing up. I kept trying. And then they brought Sophie into my life. Sophie is my granddaughter. She turned 7 last March. She has Connie's eyes, that particular shade of pale green that looks gray in certain light. And she has this little gap between her front teeth that makes her smile look like sunshine breaking through a window. I loved her from the first moment I held her in that hospital room, and I love her still. Sophie doesn't speak. She hasn't spoken a word since she was about 3 years old. The doctors called it selective mutism brought on by severe anxiety. Mitchell and Renee said she'd been evaluated, that she was in therapy, that the therapist said to be patient and not to push. I believed them. Why wouldn't I? You believe the people you trust with the child's well-being. What I noticed, and what I filed away without fully understanding, was that Sophie communicated constantly, not with words, but with everything else. She'd leave drawings on my workbench when she visited, little pencil sketches of the 2 of us fishing off the back porch or sitting together watching the Cardinals game. She'd tap my hand in rhythms that I started to think weren't random. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. She'd push her food toward me if she thought I hadn't eaten enough. She watched everything. She watched me the way a child watches something they're trying to protect. I didn't understand what she was protecting me from. Not yet. It was a Wednesday in late October when Mitchell called and asked if I could take Sophie for the long weekend. He and Renee had a conference in Scottsdale. Some pharmaceutical industry thing, he said. A big annual event that Renee couldn't miss. He sounded apologetic but distracted, the way he always sounded on the phone by then. Of course, I said. I'd have said yes in my sleep. They dropped Sophie off Friday evening around 6. She had her little pink suitcase and her backpack and her sketchbook, and she walked through my front door like she owned the place, which as far as I was concerned, she did. Renee handed me a bag with some of Sophie's things in it, her allergy medication, a specific brand of chamomile tea that she said Sophie had started drinking every night to help her sleep. She really likes the tea, Renee said. She said it twice. Make sure she has some before bed. It helps her settle. I said I would. I set the bag on the counter. I didn't think much of it. Mitchell hugged me at the door. He held on a second longer than usual, and when he pulled back his face looked strange, guilty, maybe, or scared, though I couldn't have said why. I almost asked. I should have asked. Instead, I wedged them back out of the driveway and turned to find Sophie standing in the hallway behind me, her backpack still on, her pale green eyes fixed on my face. She didn't move. She didn't look like a little girl watching her parents leave. She looked like someone who had been waiting a very long time for something to start. "You hungry, sweetheart?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "You want to see if the cardinals are on?" Nothing, just those eyes, steady and serious. I went to the kitchen to make myself a cup of decaf. I heard the front door click behind me, the latch, the way it always sounds when it's fully closed. And then I heard something I have not forgotten and will never forget as long as I am alive. Grandpa. I turned around so fast I nearly knocked the mug off the counter. Sophie was standing in the kitchen doorway. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her chin was up. She was looking at me with an expression that no 7-year-old should have to carry, the expression of someone who has made a decision that cost them something. "Grandpa," she said again, and her voice was clear and steady and small and absolutely certain. "Don't drink the coffee. Don't drink anything Mom brought." The mug was in my hand. I set it down on the counter. "Sophie," I said. My voice came out strange. "What did you say?" "The tea she brought," she said, "and the coffee in the bag. Don't drink it, please." I crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of her. My knees don't love that anymore. But I wasn't thinking about my knees. I looked at her straight on, eye level. "Sweetheart," I said, "how long have you been able to talk?" She blinked. Something passed across her face that I can only describe as relief, like she'd been holding a breath for years. "For a long time," she said, "but Mom said if I talked, she'd take me away. She said she'd send me somewhere far and I'd never see you again." She paused. "I didn't want to not see you." I sat down on the kitchen floor, just sat down right there on the linoleum, because my legs weren't working properly. Sophie sat down across from me, cross-legged, and waited with the patience of a child who has learned to wait. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything you can." And she did. It came out in pieces, the way things do when a child has been carrying something heavy for a long time. Some of it was hard to follow. She told it the way kids tell things, jumping back and forth in time, stopping to clarify details that weren't the important details, but the shape of it became clear soon enough. Renee had started putting something in my coffee about 2 years ago, according to Sophie. Sophie had seen her do it the first time during a Sunday visit. She'd gone to the kitchen for a glass of water and seen her mother shake something from a small bottle into my mug before bringing it out to the porch. Sophie had asked her about it that night, and Renee had crouched down and looked her in the eyes and told her that Grandpa was sick and the medicine helped him. That if Sophie told anyone at all, she would have to leave and go live somewhere else, somewhere without Grandpa, somewhere without Daddy, and she would never come back. Sophie was 5 years old. She believed her. Of course she believed her. 5-year-olds believe the people who are supposed to love them. But Sophie is not a typical child. Connie always said that, and she meant it as a compliment. Sophie pays attention the way most adults don't. She'd started keeping notes, actual written notes, in pencil, in her sketchbook, after she learned to read, which she taught herself mostly from my old National Geographics and the captions on the Nature Channel. She'd written down dates, descriptions, what she'd seen, She'd been keeping a record for over a year, hidden in the back of her sketchbook beneath a drawing of two people fishing. She went and got the sketchbook. I sat on my kitchen floor and read what my 7-year-old granddaughter had been carrying alone. The notes were careful and specific in the way only a child's observations can be. She wrote things like, "Mom put the drops in before stirring, 3 drops from the green bottle with no label, and Grandpa's hands were shaking at dinner, and he didn't know why." She had dates going back 14 months. She had written, in careful block letters, "I think it is making him sick. I think she wants him to get very sick." My hands were shaking when I finished reading. I don't know if it was anger or fear or just my body finally acknowledging what my brain was still catching up to. I thought about the past 2 years, the fatigue I'd attributed to getting older, the tremors that my doctor said were probably early-stage essential tremor, the brain fog that had gotten bad enough that I'd started writing myself reminder notes, something I'd never done in my life. I'd had blood work done twice, and both times my doctor had said the results were a little off, in ways he couldn't fully explain, and we'd chalked it up to diet and stress and age. I thought about the life insurance policy. Connie and I had taken it out in 2003. It was a substantial policy, the kind that seemed responsible when you had a mortgage and a kid and a wife with a family history of illness. Connie used a payout from her mother's policy to help us buy this house. We understood the value of being prepared. After Connie passed, the policy paid out to me, and after some thought I'd updated the beneficiaries. Mitchell was primary, and Sophie, through a small trust, was secondary. I am not a wealthy man, but the house is paid off and worth considerably more than I paid for it, and the policy is for $400,000, enough to change someone's life, enough to be worth something to someone who wanted it. I sat on the floor for a long time. Then I got up. I didn't panic. That's one thing the military gave me that I've never been able to shake. When the situation gets serious, I get quiet. I get methodical. Mitchell used to tease me about it, called me the glacier because I moved slow, but I didn't stop. I took the bag Renee had packed. I took the chamomile tea and the ground coffee. I set them in a paper bag in the garage away from the kitchen. Then I called my neighbor Dale, who was a retired pharmacist, and asked if he'd be willing to look at something for me first thing Saturday morning. I didn't tell him why. He said sure. I made Sophie and myself grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup for dinner. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and ate with the careful attention of a child who doesn't take a warm meal for granted, and I watched her and thought about the fact that she had spent 2 years carrying this alone. "Sophie," I said, "are you scared?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thinks about everything. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "A little," I said, "but I'm going to take care of this, okay? That's my job." She nodded. She picked up her grilled cheese. "Grandpa," she said, not looking up, "I talked because I didn't want you to die." I put my fork down. I didn't trust my voice for a moment. "I know, sweetheart," I said when I could. "Thank you." She looked up at me then, with Connie's eyes, and she said, "Are we going to be okay?" "Yes," I said, and I meant it the way I haven't meant many things in my life. Dale took one look at the contents of the bag Saturday morning, and his face went through about 6 different expressions in 10 seconds. He told me he couldn't be certain without a proper lab, but what he could tell me was that the residue on the inside of the coffee bag smelled like something he'd encountered once before in a different context. A patient who had been brought in presenting with symptoms consistent with prolonged, low-dose heavy metal exposure. He told me to get to my doctor Monday and request a full tox screen. He told me to keep the bags and not touch them with my bare hands anymore. He also told me to call someone with a badge. I called my doctor first thing Monday and told him I needed a full toxicology panel, that I had reason to believe I had been exposed to something. He didn't ask too many questions. He knows me well enough to know I don't make things up. He got me in Tuesday morning. While I waited, I called an attorney. Not just any attorney, a woman named Patricia who had handled Connie's estate and who I trusted completely. I told her what Sophie had told me, what the notes said, what Dale had suggested. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Jean, I need you to bring me those notes, and I need you to understand that what you're describing, if it's accurate, is criminal." I told her I understood. "Has Mitchell said anything to you?" she asked. "Anything at all that suggested he knew?" I thought about his face at the door Friday evening, the way he'd held on too long. "I don't know," I said. The talk screen came back Thursday. Elevated thallium levels. Not lethal, not yet, but significant and consistent with repeated low-dose exposure over an extended period. My doctor sat across from me in his office with the results in his hand and looked at me the way doctors look at you when they're choosing their words carefully, and I told him I already knew what it meant and where it had come from. He called the police while I was sitting there. The next week was the hardest of my life, including 2 combat deployments and the year Connie was dying. It's one thing to face something external. It's another thing entirely to sit in a room with a detective and describe in careful detail how your daughter-in-law has been poisoning you and your son may or may not have known. Mitchell knew. Not everything, and not from the beginning. That's what he told investigators, and I believe him because I raised him, and I know what a lie looks like on his face. What he knew was that Renee had been adding something to my food and drink. She told him it was a supplement, something to help with my cognitive decline, which she'd been subtly framing to him as more severe than it was. She'd shown him articles about natural supplements for memory. She'd told him I'd agreed to it. He hadn't asked me. He hadn't asked me directly because part of him, I think, didn't want to know, and that's the part I'm still working through. Not with anger anymore. With something sadder and more complicated than anger. Renee was arrested on a Thursday evening. Thallium poisoning, criminal poisoning, premeditated, with evidence of prolonged administration. Patricia told me the prosecution would likely go for aggravated assault with intent to commit great bodily harm and possibly attempted murder depending on how they structured the case. She told me the evidence was substantial between Sophie's notes, the residue in the bags Dale had preserved, my talk's results, and Renee's own purchasing history for the compound, which it turned out she'd sourced through a contact she'd made in her years in pharmaceutical sales. Mitchell cooperated fully with investigators. He was charged with a single count of failing to report, pled to a misdemeanor, and was sentenced to 2 years of supervised probation. He is not in jail. He calls me on Sundays. We don't have much to say to each other yet, but we're both still calling, and I think that counts for something. What I didn't expect, what gutted me in a way I wasn't prepared for, was Mitchell's face when he found out that Sophie had known, had been watching, had kept notes in her sketchbook for over a year. He sat in Patricia's conference room and he put his face in his hands and he cried like I haven't seen him cry since Connie's funeral, not because he was caught, because his 7-year-old daughter had been carrying the weight of his failures and his blindness and his cowardice alone for years, because she had been so scared of losing the people she loved that she'd swallowed her own voice to keep herself close to them, because she had given up the ability to speak, the most basic human thing, to survive in a home where the truth was dangerous. I sat across the table from my son, and I watched him understand what had been done, and I didn't say anything. Some things don't need commentary. Sophie is living with me now. The arrangement is temporary, in the legal sense, with family court involved and a guardian ad litem assigned to her case. But I don't experience it as temporary. She has Connie's old sewing room, which we've painted a soft yellow at her request, and she's put her drawings up on the wall with push pins, dozens of them, covering almost every inch of the space above her desk. She talks now. Not constantly, she's still a quiet child by nature, but freely. She asks questions the way kids are supposed to, rapid fire and occasionally exhausting, and she has opinions about everything from the correct way to make scrambled eggs. She believes in low heat and patience, which is also my position. So we are aligned to the relative merits of different bird species. She watches from the back porch. She's decided the goldfinch is underrated. I told her I agreed. She started school in November. Second grade, a good school about 4 miles from here, with the teacher named Mrs. Okafor, who sent me a note after the first week saying Sophie was one of the most observant students she'd encountered in 20 years of teaching. I read that note 3 times. I have my own recovery to manage. Thallium poisoning requires chelation therapy, which is not a pleasant process, and my doctor has me on a monitoring schedule that involves more blood draws than I'd like. My hands shake less than they did 2 months ago. The brain fog has lifted enough that I've stopped needing the reminder notes, which I'm choosing to take as progress. The doctors say I'll likely reach a full recovery. I believe them mostly, and on the days I don't entirely believe them, I look out the kitchen window at Connie's roses and remind myself that I am still here. There was a morning last week, early, before Sophie woke up. I was sitting on the back porch with a real cup of coffee, from a can I bought myself, watched myself make, and the sun was just starting to come up over the ridge and the yard was still quiet. I was thinking about Connie, the way I do most mornings, thinking about what she would have made of all this, thinking about how she used to say that the people who love you will show you, not just tell you, and how she was right about that in ways I only fully understood later. I heard the screen door open behind me. Sophie came out in her pajamas, the ones with the little stars on them, and her hair was messy and she had her sketchbook under her arm. She sat down in the chair next to mine without saying anything. She opened the sketchbook to a fresh page and started drawing, pencil moving in quick small strokes, and for a while we just sat like that in the early morning quiet. After a while she turned the sketchbook and showed me what she'd drawn. It was the 2 of us, sitting on the porch, her in the chair with her sketchbook, me with my coffee, the sunrise going on behind us. She'd drawn it from above, like a bird looking down, and she put Connie's roses along the bottom edge of the page, a whole row of them, the way they look in late spring when they're all out at once. Under the drawing, in her careful blocked letters, she'd written, "This is us. We are okay." I set my coffee down. I looked at my granddaughter. She was already back to drawing, pencil moving, entirely absorbed, entirely at home. I don't know what the coming months will look like. There are court dates ahead, and custody hearings, and more conversations with Mitchell that neither of us quite know how to have yet. There are still mornings when I wake up and the weight of it lands on me all at once. What was done, how long it went on, how close I came to not being here for any of this. But I look at Sophie across the breakfast table, gap-toothed grin over her cereal bowl, and I think about the fact that a little girl who was told her voice was dangerous chose to use it anyway, chose to use it for me. That's not nothing. That's everything. I keep coming back to a single image when I think about all of it. Sophie, 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor with her sketchbook open in her lap, handing me 14 months of notes she'd kept in secret. Block letters, careful dates, 3 drops from the green bottle with no label. She didn't know the word for what she was doing. She just knew something was wrong, and she paid attention, and she wrote it down. That's not luck. That's a kind of moral clarity I've rarely seen in adults, let alone a child who was told her own voice was a threat. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all this came out. Not in a bitter way, I'm past bitter, or trying to be, but in the way you think about things when you've had time to sit still with them. Renee made choices. She made them deliberately over 2 years, and every one of those choices set the next one in motion. The first drop in the coffee, the lie she told Mitchell about supplements, the threat she made to a 5-year-old girl in a kitchen. None of it happened in a vacuum. Each decision built the next room of the trap she was constructing, and eventually the whole structure collapsed inward because she had not accounted for the fact that Sophie was watching. What I keep returning to is that Sophie's greatest act of courage wasn't the moment she spoke. It was the 2 years before that. The years when she held the truth carefully, kept her notes, stayed close, stayed quiet, stayed present. Not because she was powerless, but because she was being strategic in the only way available to her. She was 7. She had no adult to go to that she was certain she could trust. So she gathered evidence, she waited for the right moment, and when the door shut and it was just the two of us, she made her decision. That takes more than bravery. It takes a kind of intelligence that doesn't come from school. It comes from paying genuine attention to the world and trusting what you observe. Sophie taught herself to read from old magazines because nobody taught her. She kept records because she understood, instinctively, that memory alone isn't enough. She thought clearly under conditions that would have broken most adults I know. And then she held on. For 2 years, she held on. I think about that when my mornings are hard, when the chelation therapy drags and my hands shake and I feel the weight of what nearly happened. I think about a little girl who was threatened into silence and chose anyway to stay present, to stay watchful, to stay in this house, in this family, in my life, not because it was safe, but because she loved someone who needed her. If there's anything I want to pass on from all of this, it's that the world responds to how we actually live in it. Renee built something on deception and it fell. Sophie built something on quiet, stubborn integrity and it held. Not because the universe is keeping score in some mystical sense. I'm too old and too practical for that kind of thinking. But because the things we do accumulate. The choices stack up. And eventually, the structure they build either stands or doesn't. I look at Sophie across the breakfast table and I think, whatever she becomes, she already knows the most important things. She knows how to see clearly. She knows how to endure. She knows that doing the right thing sometimes means carrying it alone for longer than anyone should have to. Those aren't qualities you can teach from a textbook. She arrived at them the hard way. So did I.